Welcome to the Christian Men at Work podcast, where I interview men from all walks of life with varying job titles who have one thing in common. They are all choosing daily to live out their Christian faith through their work, and because of that they are leading, prospering, glorifying God, and experiencing joy and purpose in their work, and you can too. Men at Work, welcome to episode 32. Today I'm going to be interviewing Reverend Dr. Art Lindsley. He is the Vice President of the Theological Initiatives at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, where he oversees the development of a theology that integrates faith, work, and economics. He joined the C.S. Lewis Institute as president in 1987 and remains a senior fellow there. Prior to that, he was Director of Educational Ministries at the Ligonier Valley Studies Center and staff specialist with the Coalition for Christian Outreach in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's an editor of and contributing author to IFWE's Counting the Cost, Christian Perspectives on Capitalism, and For the Least of These, A Biblical Answer to Poverty. Dr. Lindsley's key research in these books deals with two biblical passages commonly used to promote socialism, Leviticus 25 and the topic of Jubilee in Acts 2-5. He's also the author of C.S. Lewis's Case for Christ, True, Truth, and Love, the Ultimate Apologetic. He is co-author with R.C. Sproul and John Gerstner of Classical Apologetics, and he often writes articles on theology, apologetics, C.S. Lewis, and the lives of many other authors and teachers. Reverend Dr. Lindsley earned his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Seattle Pacific University, Master of Divinity from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and Doctor of Philosophy and Religious Studies from the University of Pittsburgh. He, his wife Connie, and their two boys, Trey and Jonathan, make their home in Arlington, Virginia. Let's get right to the interview.
Art, thanks a lot for joining the podcast today. My first question for you is, when and how did you become a Christian?
Well, first of all, it's great to be on with you, Dave, today, and glad to be able to give this input. How did I become a Christian? I was brought up in a Christian family pretty much all my life, so I think I remember a really definitive time when I was in fourth grade at a summer camp, and in response to an invitation to commit my life, I remember I did so, and afterwards I came out, and I remember standing on a hill looking out over a scene and just feeling a tremendous sense of forgiveness and closeness to the Lord. So if I had to point to one point, it would be that.
Very good. Now, you are currently Vice President of Theological Initiatives at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. Can you give us a brief overview of your career journey up to this point, including your education and the different positions?
Yeah. My education, I got a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Seattle Pacific University, and then I got a Master of Divinity from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and a PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Pittsburgh. And I worked a number of different places. I'll just give you a couple of my longer-term times. I worked at the Ligonier Valley Studies Center with R.C. Sproul for 6 years as a Director of Educational Initiatives. And then also I worked for 25 years at the C.S. Lewis Institute, but at least half or more than half as president, and then later I talked someone else into taking that role and continued on as a senior fellow so I could write further. And then after that, I went to the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, and I've been there for about 6 years now.
Well, that's great. Thanks for that summary. Now, in the book you co-authored, For the Least of These, A Biblical Answer to Poverty, you describe how best to care for the poor and provide for sustainable economic development. I guess my first question is, what are some of Christians' well-intentioned efforts to help the poor that have not worked, and what do you think is the best answer to this problem?
Well, that's a somewhat complex question, and answer too, that I can't just easily talk about everything, but I'll give a couple highlights. There's a book called When Helping Hurts, and I think a lot of what has happened in what you might call it the poverty industry has been well-intentioned, but has actually hurt more than it's helped. Like, for instance, one quote might illustrate it. Bob Lupton, in his book called Toxic Charity, says this: you give once, you elicit appreciation. Give twice, you create anticipation. Give 3 times, you create expectation. Give 4 times, and it becomes entitlement. Give 5 times, and you establish dependency. Peter Greer of Hope International is a microfinance group. Entitles his chapter, and for the least of these, Stop Helping Us. And I think the story is particularly about a church in Russia that was helped for many years by a church in the United States. And they would send them periodically food and clothes and other things that they needed. And initially it was really appreciated. But after several years, the pastor started to notice that the people were not really taking their own initiative, but they were more waiting for the American shipments to arrive. And basically, he said, stop helping us. Instead, the church gave money to help the church start a business, which employed the people that were there in the church. And that's really was a better long-term solution. Another classic book is a book called Dead Aid by CMAW032. And it essentially states, although you need to qualify this a little bit, that U.S. ought to stop, say, giving Africa aid. And obviously there should be aid in times of disaster, temporary relief. If there's a hurricane or a famine or something like that, that's essential that people deal with it. But as a long-term solution, it's really failed. And that's because a lot of the money has ended up in places where it wasn't intended. Like, for instance, she says 85% of the aid that's been given to Africa has gone to a place other than which it was intended, or it's been used in a place other than which it was intended. So that's a serious problem. I think the answer is described in various places, and for the least of these is we have a number of different chapters by some outstanding people on that. There's a great film, if you have a chance to see it, called Poverty, Inc., and that talks about the need for a new paradigm in dealing with poverty, and one particularly that deals with the importance of small businesses. Like, for instance, in the U.S., 51% of businesses are what could be described as small and medium-sized businesses, whereas in developing countries, about 16% are small businesses. So there is what's called the missing middle. You have the microfinance, the really small businesses, and then you have the small and medium, and then you have the large businesses. But often what's lacking are people in that small and medium-sized enterprise. And often there are people now that are more and more companies and venture capital forms that are following a kind of patient capital where they invest in giving people help in starting their businesses in response for a profit, but perhaps later down the road. They're not looking for it immediately, giving people opportunity and encouraging and coaching them in ways to be able to start their own businesses, held by people in the country and employ people there in the country. Maybe another example has been of foreign aid that CMAW032 talks about. That there's an example of some people in Hollywood that sent 100,000 mosquito nets over to a particular area in Africa. But unbeknownst to them, there was a factory there that was employing 15 people and producing 500 mosquito nets a day, and probably supporting maybe 150 people under that, maybe 10 per person in terms of family and extended family. And because of the free mosquito nets, that business was driven out of business. And then after 3 or 4 or 5 years, when the mosquito nets had holes in it, there was no place that was producing mosquito nets there. Maybe one other instance is there was a city in Africa that was that a church in the United States decided to send over free eggs to this city in Africa. But again, unbeknownst to them, there was a guy, Jono, that was making his living by selling eggs. And, of course, he got driven out of business. And about a year later, the church in Georgia decided not to give any more eggs. And then in that city, there were no eggs. They had to go to another city to even get it because the one person that's providing eggs and doing this business was driven out of business. So they really hadn't looked at really giving incentives and opportunity for people on the ground, people that were there in the community, to provide for needs in their community. Those are just a couple examples I could give of this kind of thing and how it's been well-intentioned, but it's actually hurt more than it's helped.
You know, when Jesus said that you'll always have the poor, what is your take on what we should take from that comment?
Yeah, if you look at the passage in Deuteronomy, it says you'll always have the poor. So the basic idea is you'll never have an excuse for not helping them. So it's not that we ought to stop or neglect the poor. It's that we'll never have an excuse for not helping the poor.
So it really comes down to, it's not a question of whether or not we're going to help the poor, but what's the most effective way to do so?
Exactly. Yep.
Which really comes down to, in a way, it's part of stewardship, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that the best way is a way that affirms, both helps people that are poor, but helps affirm their dignity as image bearers of God, because poverty is a much deeper issue than just a lack of funds or a lack of money. In fact, I think Peter Greer, again from Hope International, talked to a group of people that were poor and just asked them what poverty was like. How do you define poverty, they were asked. And, here's some of the answers. Poverty is an empty heart, not knowing your abilities and strengths, not being able to make progress, isolation, no hope or belief in yourself, knowing you can't take care of your family, broken relationships, not knowing God, not having basic things to eat, not having enough money. Poverty is a consequence of not sharing, lack of good thoughts. Now notice only one of those was not having enough things to eat and not having enough money. Basically, I think the really important thing is to give people, number one, a sense that they have great worth and value, that they're made in the image of God. They have real dignity. They also have gifts that can be used to help develop the potential of things around them. I think that in Genesis 1:26-28, we have what's called the cultural mandate, that people are made in the image of God to be able to develop the potential of the world around us. And that's what we're created for, to be able to use our dignity and our gifts as image bearers of God, again, to develop the potential of the creation around us. And so people can be empowered to do so. First of all, they need to be affirmed as people of dignity. And then secondly, given opportunity to be able to use those gifts to provide for themselves and for their family. Sometimes it requires teaching and training and vocational training and many other things. Many organizations around the world are really helping people go from the point of poverty and despair in poverty to really having hope and then actually rising out of poverty.
And this really applies to at every level. How we as individuals can help, should help others, how churches and nonprofits should help others, as well as how the government should be involved. How would you characterize what has been called the war on poverty, which is mostly, refers to the government's approach to dealing with poverty for the last number of decades? What's worked and what hasn't worked?
Well, again, that's a very complex issue, and I wouldn't want to disregard everything that has happened there. I think the danger has been, again, dependency and a lack of emphasis on enterprise. It's interesting. One of the things that I've come across in my studies is that, like in 1800, about 85% were living in desperate poverty. That means $1.25 a day or less. And then in 1950, it was 50% of people living in desperate poverty. In 1992, 25%. In 2007, 15%. And now, it's less than 10%. I think it's 9.5% are now living in desperate poverty. And it's been almost solely through enterprise. Jim Kim, who is the head of the World Bank, said that if we continue in this progress, by 2030 we'll have eliminated desperate poverty, other than perhaps 3% in situational poverty because of disasters. But, there's been a tremendous progress in that direction. And I would say any attempt by government to be able to help the poor has got to take that into account, that the ultimate way to do it is ultimately to empower people and not to just provide for them in a way that doesn't encourage their own independence and their own dignity and their own finding opportunity. And so far as the war on poverty has done that, it's not helped, but it's actually hurt. So I know that's a general answer because there are a lot of specific programs. I wouldn't want to write off all of the things that are being done, but I think generally that's the case.
What are some specific examples of successes? What works, or what has worked, either from a government or a nonprofit perspective, or just anecdotes about situations that really do work?
You mean in with regard to government?
Well, yeah, I guess specifically, maybe what are some efforts by the government that has worked well, or maybe an example of a nonprofit. You mentioned a couple of examples where good intentions didn't work out.
Right.
From a charity standpoint. What are some examples that you can point to of things that have been done well, either by a government agency or by a nonprofit?
Okay. Let me just give you a few different things. The overall perspective is, if you're going to deal with poverty, you have to deal with, first of all, government does have a place, although I think more of a negative role than positive, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then also nonprofits, and then also business and enterprise certainly has. All of those three need to be involved. I think there is a place, although I've got to be cautious in saying this, for a government safety net. I would prefer that churches do the help and provide aid rather than government in almost every case, because government is often, although not always, godless, impersonal, and so they're often inefficient and uneconomical. Whereas churches and nonprofits can be specific in terms of godly, and then also personal in terms of knowing people and adapting the aid to people's needs along the way, and much more efficient and really having an impact in a larger way. I think it's very easy. It's also uneconomical. I think some surveys have shown, and I'd have to footnote this to go into it in more detail, but essentially if you give $1 to the government, about 70 cents goes to overhead, and then also paying for government services and programs there. Maybe 30% goes directly to the poor. Whereas if you give $1 to a nonprofit or church, we'll say 30% at most, maybe less, goes to really overhead, and maybe 70% goes to directly help the poor. So I think if you have the option of churches and nonprofits helping or the government helping, I'd always choose churches and nonprofits. And if churches were up to the task of doing it, I'd say it should always be the church. one of the chapters in For the Least of These is written about some of the historical examples, like Lord Shaftesbury is a hero in evangelical lore in terms of dealing with poverty. But he maintained that really it ought to be the church and not the government that helps. So he would get his church, or there were others that were doing it as well, and map out a city and give members, elders, deacons a particular area where they went and found out what the needs were in that area and try to address it. So it was a systematic approach in the city to try to help people in very specific and personal ways, and be able to provide for all of their needs, emotional and physical and spiritual as well. So I think, I would reluctantly allow a government safety net, but again, I would always prefer churches and nonprofits to do it. Do you understand what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I do. I mean, 100 years ago, the churches did so much more than they do today. Isn't that true?
Exactly. Well, that's what, for the least of these, if you look at a chapter there in the history of dealing with poverty, you'll say that the church did take that responsibility. And the government was really not in the position of being a primary helper in terms of providing for people's needs. But the more the government takes that responsibility, I think the less churches and nonprofits do so, or at least that can be a tendency.
Well, I think back to that list that you had earlier of all the different aspects of poverty and how only really one of them had to do with material goods. The other benefit, of course, is when these things are addressed by churches, is they're much more likely to address all those different aspects of poverty,
Exactly.
not just the financial.
Exactly. People need not just money, but they need a lot of those things that I mentioned as well if they're going to be helped. The guy that came and spoke for us when we did a seminar on For the Least of These at the Heritage Foundation, and he talked about what he was doing in Texas. And it was essentially working with people out of prison. And initially, some of the guys that they were working with wouldn't even look you in the eye. They had this sense that they were, without value, that they were invisible, that they didn't carry themselves, you didn't carry their eyes or their head with real sense of dignity. And after a while, especially as they were empowered more and more with knowledge and training, and they were able to more and more be involved in the businesses, they had a sense that they really could do well in business and be able to provide for themselves and provide for people in the community. But it's a process. People need to be encouraged to take that responsibility.
Well, you also wrote a book called Counting the Cost, Christian Perspectives on Capitalism.
Yep.
Now, based on the research you've done in this area, what are some of the aspects of capitalism that you've looked at, and what conclusion? Well, I know it's a complex subject, but what are some of the conclusions you came to on this question of whether capitalism is the best system from a biblical perspective?
Well, let me just mention some of the different things that we look at there. We try to look at, is capitalism immoral, and what are the objections being made? And like one chapter is about, is capitalism based on greed, or is capitalism exploitative? Are the 1% and income inequality evidence of exploitation? And we talk about capitalism and economic development and the growth benefit for the least of these. And then we have capitalism and consumerism. Do global corporations exploit poor countries? Is capitalism bad for the environment? And a final chapter on capitalism and the cultural wasteland. So each chapter is by a different outstanding author on a variety of subjects here. And I think that a lot of it depends on how you define what capitalism is. And I think the definition is crucial, because I think an argument against abuse is not an argument against use. It's certainly true that anything that's good in God's creation can be abused. There is what C.S. Lewis said, this is thou about each thing, and then this is not thou. There's a divinely intended use for things, and then there's a divinely prohibited abuse for things. And I think capitalism or capitalists can really use because of their own sinful nature, certainly do a lot of abuses in terms of what they do. But here's what Michael Novak in this book, he writes the first chapter. Novak says, capitalism is an invention-based economic system made possible by laws protecting intellectual property, plus personal habits of economic initiative, enterprise, and practical wisdom, in which the main cause of wealth is fresh ideas, ventures, and exercise know-how. Now, that's his definition of capitalism. Now, you could object to it on various bases. You could say that intellectual property or private property is a bad thing in and of itself, as Marx says. In fact, number one rule in Marxism is abolition of private property. Or you could say economic initiative and innovation or enterprise is not a good thing. Or you could say that the fresh ideas, ventures, and exercise know-how are bad, or certainly could be used in negative ways or destructive ways, and sometimes they are. But, you have to really look at what capitalism is first, and not how people abuse free enterprise or the use of, creating new and innovative things.
I know we could talk a lot more about that, but I would like to also ask you a few other questions. Specifically, I want to ask you about the book you wrote about C.S. Lewis. Now, in your book, you talked about some of the struggles that C.S. Lewis went through as an atheist before he came to Christ. Can you share with us some of those things that he struggled with, and how he ultimately came to be a believer?
Yeah, there were a number of things that contributed. He was brought up in a sort of nominal Anglican background, and the first thing he struggled with as a young boy was problems with prayer. He'd been told that if you were truly sincere, you had to say your prayers and think about what you said the whole time. And he would say a prayer at the end of the evening, and then he would ask himself, did I really think about that, or did I really mean it? And inevitably the answer was no. And then so he'd say his prayers over and over and over again, each time finding his prayers inadequate. And finally he stopped praying because he said if he'd have kept praying like that, it would have driven him insane, and he would have been unable to sleep. So it was kind of a misunderstanding there, first of all. And then secondly, there was a thing, chronological snobbery is one of the objections he had, which is something he had to overcome in order to come to faith in Christ. That is that just because something is old-fashioned or comes out of the past, that it's therefore outmoded and wrong. And you have to ask about these things in the past, have they ever been refuted or shown to be wrong? And if so, how conclusively? Just because something's old or from the past doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. In fact, you could even say the opposite. I would say that only that which is eternal is eternally applicable and relevant to this age. Or another problem he struggled with was a problem of evil. And I have a whole chapter on that. And it was, in many ways, as he struggled with this problem of evil later on in his life, he would object to Christians and really argue, how could an all-loving, all-good, all-powerful God exist and there still be evil in the world? But he gradually started to have a problem with that because as an atheist, he believed that all truth and all morality was relative. So he realized that he couldn't really say that there was anything objectively evil. And his whole argument depended on it. And if there wasn't anything really evil, then his objection fell apart. And so in some ways he came in through the back door. He started to see if evil was real, and he did believe that it was, that there had to be a sufficient basis for it. I think I talk about in another book I wrote called True Truth, that unless God exists, there is no objective evil or good. There is objective evil and good, therefore God exists. So there's a way to come into an argument for God, even from the existence of evil. Then you have to, I suppose, deal with the other questions later on. But in any case, that was a major problem for him. And then the idea of myth, that, in his upbringing, they would study the myths, various myths that are out there, and it proved to be interesting. But somehow Christianity was exempt from being a myth. And so he had to really ask the question, is Christianity or is faith in Christ a myth? And in many ways, the decisive, one of the things that led to his belief in Christ, among many other things in the story, was a discussion he had with J.R.R. Tolkien one night at dinner. They were at dinner, and basically Lewis said, myths are lies. And Tolkien said, no, they're not. And that began a discussion that led them to walk around Magdalen College there in Oxford almost all night, debating that question. And during that time, Tolkien provided a whole case for the idea that Jesus' myth become fact. I could develop that more if you wish, but you could find it more in C.S. Lewis's Case for Christ, the book I wrote. Another problem was rationalism. His teacher, Kirk, that tutored him for exams there at Oxford, was a dyed-in-the-wool rationalist, an atheist. And it was really that rigorous questioning and perhaps the mentality of Kirk that really influenced him along the way. And then there was a whole conflict between his reason and imagination that was another step towards his coming to God. On the one hand, he saw the world as being a very grim and meaningless place. Bertrand Russell said something to the effect that an atheist ought to live their life on the basis of unyielding despair. But on the other hand, the things that he really loved in the area of imagination and wrestling with things like meaning and dignity and purpose and beauty and truth and goodness, that was what he loved in literature. But all those things would be, from his atheist perspective, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So there came to be a kind of conflict or contradiction between his reason and his imagination. And then maybe a final area was miracles, where he had trouble believing in the idea of miracles. But it's interesting that later in his life he ended up writing books about these things, like wrote a book on evil, and then wrote another book on grief and how you deal with that. A book on evil is Problem of Pain, and then A Grief Observed deals more with the emotional problem of evil. Or you think of his book Miracles. Those are some of the things that were his obstacles to faith, and the beginnings of how he overcame them.
Thanks for all that. He's such a fascinating individual. Can you describe from your book, Love is the Ultimate Apologetic, why that is true?
You think of it in a nutshell. In John 13:34, it says, that you'll know that they are my believers by their love, and it's particularly the kind of love we show that really points to the idea that they really are my disciples. But the question is, does that really uniquely point to Jesus or not? Is it something that really points to him? And I really look at not only the other worldviews not support the idea of love, but I also talk about the path to love. For instance, the two major worldviews that stand over against Christianity, or at least two of the major worldviews, are atheism, that believe all is matter, and sort of Eastern religion, that believes all is spirit. And really neither of those provide a basis for love. In fact, Darwin said, if you could show me even one act of truly other-centered action, it would annihilate my system, for such could not have been produced by natural selection. And Richard Dawkins also says the same thing. He basically says that other-centered agape love has no place in his atheist or evolutionary system. Now that's a shocking thing. In fact, he agonizes over it in the God delusion, and essentially, doesn't really have an answer for it. He believes at the end of one of his first works that love does exist, and he's glad that it does, but he doesn't have any basis to really explain it. And on the other hand, in Eastern religion, at least say in Shankara Hinduism, you have the idea that all is one. And they hold to the principle of non-distinction. But if all is one and there's not really distinct, that everything distinct from you is illusory, then there are really not distinct people that are out there. And if there's not really distinct people, how can there be other-centered love in the process? So it's a real conundrum, you might say, that these worldviews have taken to their fundamental basis that don't really.
I appreciate that, and believe me, I understand when you've written as many books that are as in depth as you have. It's kind of hard to just answer these questions, but I appreciate you giving it your best shot. With the time we have remaining, I wanted to ask you a couple of quick questions about the area of work specifically, and I guess one of the questions is it possible for men working today to have a work and life balance? Does work-life balance really exist? And if so, what suggestions do you have for someone who's trying to have work-life balance?
Okay, I would say, first of all, that I would want to emphasize that Jesus was a small businessman for about 20 years. He would have been apprentice, say, when he was about age 12 or 13. And he didn't start his ministry till he was about 30, it says in Luke 3:23. So and it could be 31, 32 that he started it. It says about 30. So for 18 to 20 years, Jesus was a small businessman. He's called a tekton. A tekton is perhaps more than a carpenter, at least that, but he would have worked with wood and stone and metal, more like a construction worker dealing with things. And if Jesus worked, he was not only a carpenter, a tekton, but the tekton. He was particularly noted in his field for being excellent, I guess, in what he did, perhaps even a foreman of particular jobs. In fact, there are about 26 economic parables of Jesus that shows Jesus' intimate knowledge of the economic system, and he uses that to provide teaching. And basically what that means is that if God sent his son to spend 18 to 20 years as a carpenter, that it must be okay to be a carpenter, and he was a small businessman, must be okay to be in business. So I think that's utterly crucial to have the idea. And then, of course, his 3 years, we say, of itinerant ministry. But if there's a whole thing about Jesus' history that validates the importance of work, and not only work in general, but working with your hands. So it's important for people that are working out there in the world to realize that their work has a dignity, worth, and value. They're not in a second-class position because they're not involved with, say, full-time Christian ministry, in quotes, or with mission overseas. I mean, many people have that assumption, that somehow being in full-time Christian ministry, or being a pastor, or being a missionary is a higher calling. And I believe it's not. And then back to the work-life balance that you mentioned, I think that basically the biblical idea of calling means that we're called to be faithful to God in all areas of life. It doesn't primarily focus on the idea of being in a specific calling. So we're called to be faithful to God in our relationship with him, to be faithful to his body in terms of the church, to be faithful in our family, to our marriages and families, our sons and daughters, our kids, and to be involved in society, say, with regard to being a good citizen. So we're called to be faithful in all those areas. And no one area is to drive out or relativize or push out the others. So, for instance, in the area of work, and of course that's the other great area where we're called to be involved, we're not to allow other areas such as, we're not to allow work to drive us away from our family, or work to drive us away from our relationship to God, or relationship to the church, and so on. So there ought to be a compatibility between those things. I've done a lot of mentoring over the years, and one of the things I've discovered is no matter how busy somebody is, there's always a way to go. If you sit down with people and work with their schedules, to be able to be faithful in the areas where you need to be. Like, for instance, sit down and find time for a relationship with God, devotional time. Spend time with family. Spend time, getting exercise, which is important for your health. There's a way to do it if you just work with people's schedules and find that people are committed to the idea of having that kind of balance, that kind of faithfulness to the Lord in all areas. I think there's a way to go to find it.
What are some ways that you would suggest the average person think about how their faith should influence their work? In other words, we just talked a bit about balancing your life between work and other areas of your life, but speaking specifically about the eight or more hours you spend every day at your job, how should a Christian think of that as being a part of their Christian life?
Well, I would say the most important thing is to realize that fundamentally our ultimate purpose in Genesis is that we're created to work. Work is not a result of the fall, but we're created to work, and that's our primary purpose, that people are made in the image of God to exercise dominion and rulership over the whole creation. Or in Genesis 2:15, Adam and Eve were there to care for and keep the garden, so that our primary role is to work. Now, because of the fall, we have alienation from God, we have alienation from others, and we have alienation from the creation, from our work. But part of the gospel and the Great Commission is to have us come to believe and be able to reverse the effect of sin, that redemption can be applied not only to us personally in terms of our relationship to God, but now we're moved into a community relationship with others in the church, and then ultimately to be able to bring about work with the Lord and bringing His kingdom to this earth as it is in heaven. And so to bring about His rule and reign wherever we go. So work is valuable in and of itself. And that's something that most people don't fully grasp. That work is what we're created to do. So, it's certainly of value to be able to share the gospel at work. And I'd say when it's appropriate, but I had a professor say there are times where it's positively immoral to share the gospel at work, and that is when you should be working. And you're taking away from what the company pays you to do. Other times in break times and in lunch or dinner after work that you can do that. But we don't just work in order to share the gospel. We don't just work to make money to give to the church and mission, although that's a good thing too, to do that. But that's not the primary purpose of work. The primary purpose of work is to be faithful to the gifts God has given us and to be able to work for transformation in whatever arena we work in.
Do you have a favorite scripture or life verse?
Well, I think I have a few of them. I was trying to think about that, and maybe one, Ephesians 6:10 is one. Be strong in the Lord and the power of His might. But I have another couple passages that I love. One is Matthew 12:18-21 that is probably the best, most concise perspective on Jesus, that talks about a bruised reed He will not break, and a smoldering wick He will not quench until He leads justice to victory. It's the whole relationship between justice and compassion in Jesus. And then also Psalm 130, which is one of the penitential psalms, where it talks about out of the depths I've cried to you, O Lord, and how forgiveness is so essential to our lives. So I think those three would be some passages that are very important to me.
Do you have any suggestions for men like me who have a long commute every day as far as how to make the best use of that commute, as far as maybe listening to certain things?
Well, what I do is I often listen to either, the Bible on tape sometimes, go through a book of the Bible or more, depending on how short they are, while I'm traveling on my phone. And then also sermons. If you wanted to do something more in the realm of apologetics, I've got 20-hour-long lectures that are available, most of them on YouTube, called the Basic Apologetics Course. It's also available on the CSOS Institute website, and you could listen to those. They're all roughly about an hour each, and so you could get a whole course in apologetics. It's on both audio and video. And again, most of them are on YouTube. This Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics has a lot of podcasts that are available on our website that you could listen to those. Like I have a talk, it's about a 30-minute talk on calling, or various other topics by Hugh Welchel or Ann Bradley or others on various topics. Jay Richards is another one. So there are a lot of different podcasts that are out there that you could listen to.
Well, that's great. I know we've covered a lot of material. Maybe we can talk again because there's so much more I know that we could talk about. But if anyone wanted to learn more about you or reach out to you to talk more about what we just discussed, I know you just mentioned some of your apologetics videos on YouTube and the website. Can you? Is there anything else you want to offer in terms of people getting a hold of you or accessing
sure. They could just email me at my work address, which is Lindsley, ALINDSLEY at TIFWE.org. Or you could just go to the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, and probably with general information it will eventually get to me. But Lindsley, LINDSLEY at TIFWE.org, TIFWE.org.
Very good. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you, Dave.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Men at Work, I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I have. We just heard about Reverend Dr. Art Lindsley's journey being spirit-led at his work. Each of our journeys are unique, but hopefully you've heard something in this episode to inspire you and give direction for your own personal daily work life. You can find links and other information from this show at davehilgendorf.com. Until next time, have a great day and God bless.